Summer, 1944. A U.S. prisoner of war camp somewhere in the American Midwest. Barbed wire glints under the afternoon sun. Guard towers watch in silence. Inside the compound, dozens of Japanese prisoners stand in formation, rigid and expressionless, bracing for what they believe will be another day of humiliation. They wait. Still. Prepared for orders barked in anger. Instead, something unexpected happens. A group of American guards walks across the yard carrying wooden bats, leather gloves, and a canvas bag filled with baseballs. Another guard wheels out chalkboards and books, placing them beneath a makeshift awning. The prisoners stare in disbelief, unable to make sense of what they are seeing. One guard gestures to the empty field. Another taps a bat lightly against his palm. A simple invitation. Play. Whispers ripple through the Japanese ranks. Some step back, confused. Others exchange uneasy glances, unable to reconcile this moment with everything they were taught about the enemy, because nothing in their training, their culture, or their expectations of capture prepared them for this. Americans offering education and a baseball game. The moment marks the beginning of a transformation none of them ever anticipated. Long before Japanese POWs found themselves staring at baseball diamonds and bookshelves in American camps, both nations entered the war carrying deeply rooted beliefs about honor, captivity, and enemy behavior. These beliefs shaped every moment of the Pacific conflict, and they collided violently. When Japanese soldiers were first captured in Imperial Japan, surrender was not an option. The Bushido Code, reinforced by military indoctrination, taught that death was preferable to capture. Soldiers were instructed that Americans tortured prisoners, mutilated them, or executed them without hesitation. These ideas, spread through training manuals, propaganda films, and officers' speeches, seeped into the mentality of every Japanese unit. So, when Japanese soldiers were first captured on Guadalcanal in 1942, they expected brutality. Many begged to be killed rather than taken alive. Some even attempted suicide when approached by U.S. Marines. What they encountered instead shocked them. American medics treating wounded prisoners, guards offering cigarettes, and interrogators addressing them respectfully through interpreters. These were not isolated incidents. They were anchored in law. The United States, despite the brutality of the Pacific War, adhered closely to the 1929 Geneva Convention, which guaranteed humane treatment for all POWs. This included shelter, food, medical care, recreation, education, and protection from abuse. Even labor assignments had strict rules. American commanders were aware that Japan had not signed the Geneva Convention and frequently mistreated U.S. captives, but they refused to adopt similar methods. The reason was twofold. First, America's military doctrine and political culture valued the rule of law. Second, humane treatment produced cooperation. Prisoners who felt safe were more willing to communicate, work, or reveal intelligence. Harsh treatment led only to resistance. By 1943, thousands of Japanese POWs were being shipped to the United States. For many, the journey itself was surreal. They expected beatings, starvation, or executions. Instead, they received medical checks, clean uniforms, and meals that far exceeded their wartime rations. Their shock grew when they saw American civilians at ports, staring curiously, not angrily, at arriving POWs. It was the first hint that the image of the American beast was a myth. But the greatest surprise awaited them behind the fences of U.S. camps. There, alongside barracks and mess halls, stood libraries, classrooms, workshops, and wide fields carved out for sports. It was here that Japanese POWs would encounter something they never imagined possible during wartime: the chance to learn, to rebuild, and to play. A chance to understand an enemy they had been taught to fear. When Japanese POWs first entered American camps, they expected rigid confinement, hunger, and punishment. Instead, they stepped into environments that were carefully structured, surprisingly orderly, and rooted in a philosophy unfamiliar to them: rehabilitation through humane treatment. By 1944, the United States operated more than 140 POW camps across the country. Most were located in rural areas, the Midwest, the South, and the Mountain West, chosen for their distance from coast and major cities. The camps were built according to standardized War Department guidelines: barracks, mess halls, medical wards, recreational grounds, and notably, classrooms. The presence of educational facilities was often the first sign to Japanese prisoners that America's approach to captivity differed radically from their expectations. The U.S. military believed that structured activity prevented unrest. Idle prisoners became anxious, fearful, or defiant. But prisoners who worked, studied, or played sports tended to stabilize emotionally and integrate into camp routines. This logic aligned perfectly with American cultural values: discipline through routine, improvement through education, and unity through sport. Sports, especially baseball, held a special place in American society. Before the war, it was already Japan's most popular Western sport, introduced decades earlier by American educators. But Japanese soldiers never imagined they would see it inside a POW camp. Many believed the Americans would view them only as enemies. not as human beings capable of play or learning. U.S. commanders saw things differently. Baseball served multiple purposes. It eased tensions between prisoners and guards. It allowed POWs to release stress and frustration. It provided structure, teamwork, and physical activity. It created opportunities for communication and observation. The baseball fields inside POW camps were not luxuries, they were tools of stability. Whether the prisoners fully understood this at first did not matter. What mattered was that the guards did not treat them with cruelty, but with predictable, consistent order, something many POWs had not expected from an enemy they had been taught to hate. Education programs were equally transformative. Classes covered English, mathematics, science, and even political philosophy. Civilian volunteers, Japanese-speaking Nisei Americans, and military instructors led lessons. Some POWs studied engineering or agriculture. Others practiced typing or learned about democratic institutions. The American goal was to occupy the mind, not just the body. This had an unintended effect. Many Japanese prisoners began questioning the propaganda that had shaped their worldview. They compared American treatment with what they had been promised: torture, starvation, humiliation, and found only contradiction. This gap between expectation and reality became the seed of reflection and eventually transformation. But the most unexpected bridge between the captors and the captured was the sound of a ball striking a wooden bat. Baseball games soon became daily events inside several camps. Teams formed, schedules were made, spectators cheered, and slowly, the distance between enemy and human began to shrink. It was a quiet cultural revolution unfolding behind barbed wire, one that neither side had anticipated for Japanese soldiers, raised on the belief that surrender meant shame and certain torment. Entering an American POW camp was a moment of profound fear. Many had prepared themselves for the worst: starvation, forced labor until collapse, or humiliation at the hands of their captors. The psychological weight of surrender alone was already crushing. Now, they braced for brutality, but what greeted them instead was bewildering. They saw guards who did not strike them, nurses who treated their wounds, and orderly lines for meals that resembled military dining more than confinement. They received blankets, medical checks, and clothing. The food, though simple by American standards, was far better than the meager rations they had survived on during the Pacific campaigns. This created a strange emotional tension. Relief existed alongside disbelief. Gratitude wrestled with confusion. How could an enemy painted as barbaric behave with such restraint? For many, it was the first moment their worldviews cracked. The shock only deepened when they saw classrooms inside the camp, desks, chalkboards, and shelves filled with books. And when they noticed open fields painted with makeshift baselines, and dirt mounds shaped into pitchers' mounds, many thought it was some sort of trick, but it wasn't. Education and recreation were not rewards. They were policy. Some POWs cried upon realizing they would not be abused. Others felt shame, believing they had disgraced their families by becoming prisoners, only to be shown kindness by the enemy. A few resisted internally, trying to maintain hatred. Yet day by day, the simple routines of learning, reading, and playing began softening hardened perceptions. Humanity, unexpected, disarming, and powerful, became the first step in transforming how these prisoners saw America. And eventually, themselves. The United States did not allow baseball games or education programs inside POW camps, simply out of generosity. These decisions reflected a carefully crafted system influenced by legal obligation, military experience, and psychological insight. American commanders recognized early that prisoners treated harshly became unpredictable. They rioted, they refused work, they attacked guards. But prisoners who were engaged, educated, and physically active were manageable. Order came not from fear, but from structure. The Geneva Convention provided a foundation. POWs must receive adequate food, humane treatment, and opportunities for recreation and learning. But America went beyond minimum requirements. War Department policy emphasized productive occupation, believing that a busy mind was less likely to resist or disrupt. Baseball, then, was not a luxury. It was a stabilizing tool. It prevented boredom and unrest. It encouraged teamwork among prisoners. It offered guards a predictable daily rhythm. It created common ground between captors and captured. Education served another strategic purpose. Teaching English, democracy, or technical skills exposed prisoners to American values. Some POWs who embraced these lessons later became educators, government officials, or reformers in post-war Japan, an outcome the U.S. quietly hoped for as the war neared its end and post-war planning began. Additionally, humane treatment was a psychological weapon aimed at Japanese soldiers still fighting in the Pacific. The more Japanese POWs reported kind treatment, the more likely future surrenders became. While this effect was limited, surrender remained taboo. It slowly chipped away at the myth of American barbarity. Thus, the baseball fields and classrooms were not signs of weakness. They were expressions of a strategic, disciplined, and deeply human approach to warfare, one that valued long-term influence over immediate domination. For many Japanese POWs, The sight of baseball equipment inside a POW camp felt unreal, even disrespectful. In Japan, baseball had existed for decades, but it had taken on a rigid, almost martial character. Training was intense. Team coaches pushed players brutally. The sport symbolized endurance and discipline, not leisure. Seeing Americans treat baseball as recreation, laughter, or stress relief challenged Japanese cultural expectations. They had been raised on strict hierarchy and physical toughness. Americans played with an ease and joy that seemed foreign, but something began to shift. Japanese prisoners who were initially hesitant found themselves drawn to the field. Watching Americans swing bats casually but effectively reminded them of high school memory. University leagues, or pre-war company teams back home. Baseball became a bridge between cultures, familiar enough to feel safe, yet different enough to provoke curiosity. Games inside POW camps soon developed their own culture. Japanese players practiced with precision, often outperforming American teams. Guards marveled at their discipline, quick reflexes, and technical skill. Spectators formed cheering sections, blurring lines between captor and captive. Baseball became more than recreation. It became a shared language. A sport that once symbolized Western influence in Japan now symbolized connection. It gave POWs a sense of dignity and identity, a reminder that they were more than defeated soldiers behind barbed wire. And for Americans, it reinforced the idea that humane treatment could break barriers propaganda had built for years. Behind every pitch, every swing, every cheer, a quiet cultural transformation unfolded, one that neither side expected when the war began. War strips men of identity. Capture strips them even further. For Japanese POWs, the psychological collapse that accompanied surrender was profound. Many believed they had failed their emperor, their families, and their comrades. The shame felt heavier than the chains. Some refused food. Others withdrew into silence. A few attempted suicide. Yet something unexpected began to happen inside the American camps. The simple acts of reading, writing, practicing English, or stepping onto a baseball field began rebuilding pieces of identity that war had destroyed. The POWs rediscovered normalcy, not through military drills or propaganda, but through classroom discussions, handwritten essays, and the rhythmic sounds of batting practice. Sports had a therapeutic effect. The physical movement, the teamwork, the familiar routines, all helped prisoners escape the crushing isolation of captivity. Even those who initially resisted began watching from the sidelines, then participating, then competing. Education played an equally powerful role. Prisoners learning English or studying civics encountered ideas they had never been exposed to. Democratic debate, individual rights, open criticism of leaders. Scientific thinking divorced from ideology. These experiences didn't replace their cultural identity. They expanded it. POWs slowly shifted from feeling like disgraced soldiers to human beings capable of growth. Some kept journals. Others requested books. Many began speaking respectfully with American instructors, forming relationships that softened hatred. This psychological restoration was neither forced nor manipulative. It emerged organically from structure, respect, and opportunity, proving that humanity, when offered consistently, can transform even the deepest wounds of war. Every POW camp reflected the values of its leadership. American commanders determined whether discipline came through fear or respect, and many chose the latter. Officers at camps like Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, Camp Huntsville, Texas, and Kuskia, Idaho believed that order grew from mutual understanding, not brutality. They enforced rules firmly, but treated prisoners as men, not enemies. They ensured classrooms had supplies, baseball fields were maintained, and work schedules were fair. Many spoke openly with POWs, encouraging conversation while prohibiting mistreatment by guards. Their approach had a profound effect. POWs expected cruelty. Instead, they encountered professionalism. They anticipated rage. Instead, they met calm structure. They braced for insults. Instead, they received clear, respectful instruction. On the Japanese side, leadership evolved as well. Officers held inside the camps initially fought against American influence. Some forbade their men to participate in classes or baseball, fearing it would weaken discipline or dishonor Japan. A few used intimidation to maintain hierarchy, but these attitudes softened with time. Senior POWs saw that the Americans were not converting them. They were simply giving them space to live. Eventually, even strict officers permitted their men to join games or study groups. Some even played baseball themselves, finding relief in a sport they once associated with discipline but now rediscovered as joy. Leadership, on both sides of the wire, shaped the camp into a functional, humane environment, and that leadership proved decisive in turning former enemies into participants in shared routines, shared learning, and shared humanity. For Japanese prisoners, adapting to life inside an American camp was not just a physical adjustment. It was an emotional and cultural reckoning. They had been taught that Americans were ruthless, undisciplined, even subhuman. Seeing guards smile, teachers patiently explain grammar, and soldiers laugh during baseball games shattered these perceptions instantly. Yet this transformation was not easy. Many POWs struggled with shame. Participating in education or recreation felt like admitting comfort in captivity, an act considered dishonorable in Japanese military culture. Some resisted interaction with Americans, isolating themselves or clinging to strict routines, but the environment slowly broke down these barriers. Guards sharing a baseball glove, a teacher praising a well-written English sentence, a medic dressing a wound without judgment. Small acts eroded hardened stereotypes. Eventually, prisoners began accepting their new reality. They realized they were not being coerced. They were being treated as human beings. Many came to admire elements of American society: fairness in rules, cleanliness in routines, informality in conversation, and the openness of debate. By late 1945, surveys conducted in POW camps showed a remarkable shift. Majority of Japanese prisoners expressed positive impressions of the United States. An unimaginable outcome at the war's start. The process was slow, painful, and deeply personal, but it showed one undeniable truth. Even in the aftermath of brutal conflict, dignity has the power to soften hatred, rebuild identity, and forge understanding between sworn enemies. By early 1945, the Japanese POW camp at Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, had transformed into a place unlike anything its prisoners could have imagined during war. The fields once associated with roll call and labor details now echoed with the familiar sound of leather gloves snapping and wooden bats cracking. What began as a tentative experiment in recreation was becoming the defining cultural heartbeat of the camp. The turning point arrived on a quiet spring afternoon. The sun hung low over the camp, casting long lines of shadow along the outfield fence. American guards stood along the perimeter, arms crossed, watching with curiosity. Japanese prisoners, some former school athletes, others who had never played beyond childhood, gathered along the base paths, stretching, talking softly, adjusting their makeshift uniforms. The teams had chosen names. They had appointed captains. They had crafted lineups with military precision. As one Japanese POW later recalled, "It was the first time in captivity that we felt like ourselves again." On this day, the camp's leadership approved something unprecedented: a full baseball match between two Japanese POW teams, officiated by American guards, with spectators from both sides lining the sideline. The tension was palpable, but not from hostility. It came from disbelief that such a gathering could be possible between captor and captive. During a world war, the crack of the first pitch broke the silence. A sharp, clean sound, the unmistakable thump of ball into catcher's glove. The game began, and suddenly, the atmosphere shifted. Japanese players moved with speed, precision, and discipline that startled the American. Years of cultural emphasis on practice and endurance revealed itself through powerful swings, fluid fielding, and synchronized teamwork. The guards exchanged glances, impressed. One leaned toward another and murmured, "These guys are better than half the leagues back home." Laughter spread along the sideline. Cheering broke out, first from prisoners, then from guards. The rigidity of war dissolved into something human, something shared. On the mound, a former university pitcher from Osaka delivered fastballs that snapped through the air with professional-level control. His counterpart, a pitcher from a Tokyo company team, countered with breaking balls that danced across the plate. Every crack of the bat drew applause from both sides of the wire. What made the moment transformative was not the athletic skill, though it was remarkable, but the emotional shift occurring in real time. Japanese POWs, who had arrived at the camp expecting humiliation and brutality, now stood at home plate being applauded by their captors. American guards, who had been told these men were sworn soldiers of a fanatical enemy, now saw them smiling, sweating, arguing calls, and celebrating doubles to the gap. Human beings, not caricatures shaped by wartime propaganda. The climax of the game arrived in the seventh inning. A long fly ball soared toward the outfield, dropping just beyond the reach of the left fielder. Two runners sprinted home. The benches erupted. Even the guards joined in the noise, unable to resist the infectious excitement. At that moment, something unspoken passed between both sides. The war was still raging across the Pacific, but here, on this dusty field, there was no hatred. No propaganda. No ideology. Only the shared joy of a game. And as the sun dipped behind the horizon, Japanese prisoners realized they had encountered something powerful, not a gesture of weakness, but a profound expression of American humanity. This baseball field, surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers, had become a bridge neither side expected to cross. The baseball game at Camp McCoy set a precedent, but what happened next transformed a simple pastime into a defining moment of connection between two nations at war. Weeks after the first match, the camp announced an extraordinary event. A Japanese POW all-star team would play against a team of American guards. Word spread through the barracks like electricity. The Japanese prisoners, stunned that they were being treated not just as players but as worthy opponents, practiced with renewed intensity. Every afternoon, the field buzzed with activity, grounders snapping, mitts popping, voices shouting encouragement. Some POWs even crafted better gloves by reworking scraps of leather and twine. Others built makeshift scoreboards or carved bats to match the weight they remembered from home. American guards trained as well, partly in camaraderie, partly in pride. They knew the Japanese players were talented, unexpectedly talented, and no one wanted to lose on their own field. When the day of the game arrived, the camp felt strangely unified. Prisoners and guards gathered around the diamond, forming a crowd unlike anything seen in the history of POW camps. A soft breeze carried the smell of dust and pine. The barbed wire perimeter stood quietly in the background. More symbolic than oppressive in this moment, the Japanese team took the field first, bowing slightly, a gesture of respect that surprised the American. The U.S. team responded with nods and a few light-hearted cheers. Then, as if acknowledging the gravity of the moment, the umpire, an American sergeant, called "play ball." The game began with intensity. The Japanese pitcher, known in the camp for his sharp control, fired a strike straight down the middle. The crowd erupted. The American batter grinned, tapped the plate, and dug in for the next pitch. What unfolded over the next several innings stunned both sides. Japanese players displayed extraordinary discipline. Their infielders executed double plays with swift, practiced movements. Their outfielders sprinted with precision honed from years of pre-war training. Their teamwork was seamless, almost elegant, the product of a culture where baseball had long been played. With near military devotion, American players countered with raw strength and enthusiasm, hitting towering fly balls and sliding aggressively into bases, drawing both cheers and gasps from the POW crowd. As the game progressed, the tension gave way to something neither language nor politics could express: mutual admiration. Guards shouted praise when Japanese players made difficult catches. Prisoners clapped loudly when Americans drove in runs. Children from nearby towns, allowed to watch from outside the fence, stood on tiptoes, enthralled. Then came the defining moment. In the 8th inning, with the score tied, a Japanese batter connected with the pitch so cleanly that the sound echoed across the entire camp. The ball soared deep into left field, landing just inside the chalk line. 2 runners scored. The crowd erupted, prisoners cheering at full voice, guards clapping sincerely, smiles spreading across faces that had once regarded each other only as enemies. It was a moment of pure, unfiltered humanity. The game ended shortly afterward. The Japanese team won by a narrow margin, but the score was irrelevant. What mattered was the connection forged under the open sky, in a place surrounded by wire meant to divide. For a few hours, war faded. Soldiers who had once fought with deadly force stood shoulder to shoulder, shaking hands, offering congratulations, even joking despite the language barrier. That night, as lights flickered off across the camp, Japanese POWs whispered among themselves, many in disbelief. The Americans allowed us to win. The Americans respect us. This would never happen in Japan. The realization was transformative. The enemy was no longer a monster. The enemy was human, and unexpectedly, profoundly kind. This was the climax of the POW experience, the moment resentment cracked, distrust softened, and the seeds of post-war friendship began to take root. When the cheers of the baseball game faded and the dust settled on the camp field, the impact of what happened did not disappear with the sunset. It continued to echo through the daily lives of the Japanese POWs, reshaping their expectations, their emotions, and their understanding of the world outside Imperial Japan. The transformation began quietly. Men who had once sat silently in their barracks now discussed batting techniques, pitching grips, and fielding strategies. Small notebooks circulated, filled with hand-drawn diagrams of plays. POWs who had refused to participate at first began drifting toward the field, watching with curiosity before eventually joining practice sessions. Even those who had never played found themselves drawn into the energy of the sport. But the baseball field was only one part of the change. A broader psychological shift had begun. Education becomes a second battlefield, one of ideas, not weapons, with morale improving. Attendance in the camp's education programs grew rapidly. English classes that once held 10 students now filled entire rooms. Workshops in mathematics, science, and agriculture gained popularity. Civics classes, taught by Japanese-speaking soldiers or civilian volunteers, introduced concepts that many POWs had never encountered: elected leadership, freedom of speech, open debate, individual rights, press transparency. Men raised under strict hierarchy and censorship. These ideas were astonishing. Some resisted, believing them dangerous or foreign, but others found themselves intrigued, even inspired. Quiet debates emerged in barracks long after lights out. Some POWs began writing journals in mixtures of Japanese and English, practicing new vocabulary while wrestling with unfamiliar concepts. American guards noticed the shift. The camp felt calmer, tensions eased. Work assignments ran more smoothly. The War Department, monitoring these changes, realized that humane treatment was achieving something no leaflet or broadcast could accomplish in the Pacific. It was reshaping how captured Japanese soldiers perceived the United States. New kind of loyalty to fairness, not force for POWs. The greatest shock was consistency. Rules were enforced, but fairly. Food was rationed, but never withheld. Punishments existed, but never involved humiliation or brutality. Many prisoners began trusting the camp staff not because they were forced to, but because the guards proved themselves reliable. That reliability stood in stark contrast to the expectations ingrained by Japanese military doctrine, where brutality from superiors was common and respect was conditional. Some POWs began confiding in American officers, others volunteered for labor details. A few even acted as interpreters for new arrivals, helping ease their transition. Although still prisoners, they were rediscovering dignity. The baseball field becomes a symbol long after the first game. Baseball remained the heart of the camp. Teams formed leagues. Championship brackets were posted on bulletin boards. American guards occasionally joined games or umpired with enthusiasm for POWs. Baseball represented something deeper than entertainment. Return to normalcy, a reminder of pre-war life and escape from shame. A shared language with the enemy. A place where skill mattered more than rank. Baseball field became a place where identity could be rebuilt, not around national pride or military glory, but around something universally human. Play. By late 1945, some camps even held tournaments attended by American families from nearby towns. A surreal sight for men who had once expected nothing but hostility. The transformation was underway, but the long-term consequences for both Japan and the United States were only beginning to reveal themselves. By the time World War II ended in August 1945, the Japanese POWs held in American camps had undergone a transformation few could have predicted. At the start of the conflict, what happened behind those fences, the education, the humane treatment, the baseball games, would ripple outward into the shaping of post-war Japan. Returning home, POWs carry new ideas into a broken nation. When repatriation finally began in 1946, thousands of Japanese POWs boarded ships for home. Many left America with mixed emotions, relief at returning, shame at having been captured, and a quiet, often unspoken gratitude for the humanity experienced. But the Japan they returned to was shattered. Cities were burned to ashes. Industry was crippled, food was scarce, families were dispersed or lost. Into this devastated landscape came men who carried something unexpected. Knowledge. English-speaking POWs were suddenly in high demand. Those who had studied agriculture or engineering in camp found work rebuilding infrastructure. Others, who had learned American democratic principles, became teachers, administrators, or advisors in local governance. Historians later noted that former POWs formed a quiet but influential undercurrent within Japan's reconstruction. Men who, having seen an enemy respect their dignity, were more willing to engage with new political ideas and international cooperation. Baseball's remarkable post-war journey. Perhaps the most visible legacy of the POW experience was the explosion of baseball culture in Japan after the war. The sport had existed there since the late 1800s, but wartime nationalism had suppressed Western influences. Now, returning POWs brought stories of baseball fields in American camps, fields where guards and prisoners played side by side. These stories spread rapidly. Teams formed in universities, companies, towns, and newly established high schools. By the 1950s, baseball had become the nation's #1 sport, surpassing even the most traditional game. Star players became national icons. International exhibition games between Japan and the United States drew crowds in the tens of thousands. Many scholars argue that baseball's rise in Japan was accelerated, even rekindled, by the POW experience. For prisoners, baseball had symbolized humanity, normalcy, and respect. For post-war Japan, it became a cultural bridge that connected a defeated nation to the democracy guiding its reconstruction. A surprising diplomatic influence. American observers were equally stunned. Reports from War Department officials noted that Japanese POWs overwhelmingly expressed positive impressions of the United States by the time of repatriation. This was not propaganda, it was the result of daily lived experience. The U.S., recognizing the significance of this shift, quietly incorporated humane POW policies into broader strategies for post-war stability. Treating POWs with dignity had accomplished what no leaflet, broadcast, or political speech could. It demonstrated American values through action. Some former POWs later returned to the United States as students, businessmen, or cultural ambassadors. Others encouraged their children to learn English or study abroad. These subtle but profound changes contributed to the foundation of one of the strongest post-war alliances in the modern world. A final legacy. Baseball bats and textbooks inside wartime POW camps seemed insignificant at the time, but for thousands of men, they became symbols of a world larger than war, a world where honor did not require hatred, and where humanity could survive even behind barbed wire. And in the decades that followed, those lessons helped bridge to nations that had once met only on battlefield. War is often remembered for its brutality, for the destruction it leaves behind, and for the deep divisions it carves between nations and peoples. Yet within this vast landscape of violence, there are rare moments when humanity rises quietly, unexpectedly, and changes everything. The story of Japanese POWs allowed to study, learn, and play baseball inside American camps is one of those moments. These men entered captivity carrying fear, shame, and the weight of a lifetime's worth of propaganda. They believed the enemy would treat them without mercy. They braced themselves for torment, but what they encountered instead was structure, dignity, and opportunities that no prisoner expected. The chance to read, to debate, to heal, to play, on those dusty baseball fields and inside those makeshift classrooms. Something deeper than recreation or education took shape. Enemies glimpsed each other not through the lens of ideology, but through the shared rhythms of daily life, the thump of a ball in a glove, the quiet hum of discussion, the laughter that rose naturally during a game neither side fully knew they needed. This was not weakness. It was wisdom. The United States understood that treating prisoners humanely would create stability, encourage cooperation, and perhaps sow seeds that would matter long after the war ended. And for the Japanese POWs, these seeds took root in unexpected ways, shaping post-war careers, influencing local communities, and helping rebuild a nation shattered by conflict. Baseball, of all things, became a symbol of this transformation. A simple game, played between fences built for war, carried within it the power to rebuild dignity and forge connection. It showed that even in captivity, the human spirit could be restored. And in the decades that followed, the relationship between Japan and the United States, once defined by firebombs and battlefields, evolved into one of partnership, respect, and shared culture. All because, in the darkest years of war, humanity chose to reveal itself where no one expected it, behind barbed wire, on a baseball field, between former enemies who learned to see one another as human again.